All right, welcome to another episode of Lifting and Yapping. The theme of today's discussion, we're going to be talking all things unilateral versus bilateral strength work. This has been quite a contentious topic over the years, but I feel like a lot of our thinking around this subject has progressed. So I'll talk about where I'm currently feeling about the state of play. What is the value of each? Why would I go for one over the other? What are the myths that have been made up about both of them? A workout should be on the right of the screen. If you want to grab a free trial of general physical preparation, head to the show notes and get stuck in. And we're going to start out with our warm-up series where we've got a handstand progression, some extensive plyometrics, and then a hamstring and calf isometric to get that blood pumping. So I'd say the two competing philosophies at either side of this continuum that's led to this sort of unilateral versus bilateral strength training debate, you've got Westside on one extreme of the continuum, and then you've got Mike Boyle on the other side of the continuum. And I feel like what sort of set the tone for this is, we had such a strong Westside influence on strength training for strength and conditioning purposes. And I think the thought process was, powerlifters are masters of the weight room, so even if you're trying to strength train for other purposes, you should look to the way that powerlifters are doing things because they're some of the best strength trainees in the world, or they're the best at strength training, so just do it the way that they do it. And then on the other side of the continuum, I guess we've got the Mike Boyle philosophy where it's, trying to get a little bit more specific in the weight room with the way that you strength train. It's like, if we're going to be performing these alternating unilateral patterns when we run, and we're trying to strength train for that, well, let's make the weight room look a little bit closer to that. A lot of these training philosophies emerged multiple decades ago, and this is when we had a much stronger association with heavy lifting and injuries. Now that we've actually looked at the numbers, we realize that lifting weights are so much safer than so many other sports. Literally one of the most safest activities you can participate in, and that's because it's such a controlled environment relative to a lot of other athletic or sporting contexts. All right, so let's cover the Mike Boyle perspective on the benefits of unilateral weight training versus bilateral weight training. So I think one of the things that Mike Boyle absolutely nailed is athletes, for the most part, aren't powerlifters. So they do have a different set of needs and requirements from strength training. Having said that, I don't think it's necessarily in the joint angles or the setups for our exercise selection. I think it's more in the dose, like just realizing that strength isn't the be-all end-all for your athletes. Their sport is still the main thing. But just because they have different needs from strength training doesn't mean that they need specifically different exercise selection or anything like that. Another thing that's always highlighted by Mike Boyle when it comes to the differences between unilateral and bilateral strength training is where you're dealing with much higher levels of axial loading when it comes to the bilateral exercises because we're typically working with much heavier weights. So when you're doing a bilateral back squat, you're probably going to have significantly more weight on your back than when you're doing a unilateral variation or some sort of split squat. Athletes might actually benefit from a little bit more axial loading. I think what Boyle is onto here is that it's important to acknowledge that there is heavier axial loading in bilateral strength training, but then with unilateral strength training, you've got to have the weight on your back for twice as long because you've got to do each side individually. So one isn't strictly worse than the other. If you're having a sensitivity to intense axial loading, then bilateral lifting, it might not be the best setup for you. Having said that, if you've got a work capacity and endurance issue, or that's affecting your tolerance, then unilateral work is just going to mean twice as long with the weight on your back. One other thing I think, there's this huge misconception about the safety of unilateral versus bilateral lifting. Both anecdotally, me and everyone I've talked to has come much closer to meeting God in a heavy split squat setup than a heavy bilateral setup. Unilateral work is fundamentally much more unstable. There is such a higher chance of you falling over with a really, really heavy weight on your back. Like I said, it's just, heavy lifting increases risk. And it's important to remember that the weight room is overwhelmingly safe, especially when we compare it to a lot of the other activities that we participate in daily without a second thought. So it's not like this axial loading is a bug of the system or a feature of the system. It just is what it is. You have to think about what your athlete's needs are and what their tolerances are. Now let's get into the specificity or the dynamic correspondence argument. Unilateral exercises, really more specific for athletes who have to run around and perform these alternating activities in asymmetrical environments. Not really, because just because you're doing a sport doesn't mean that you always have your legs set up in this asymmetrical stance. There are a lot of sporting contexts, just as many where we have our feet in a line. So again, it's context dependent. And something I'll say about this is we're not looking to make every single aspect of our physical preparation completely specific to our sport. We're trying to make it specific to the adaptations that we're chasing. So we don't have to mimic our sport with the joint angles or anything like that with our strength training. We're chasing specific adaptations. And the reality is that athletes can achieve the specific adaptations that they're looking for with strength training that is bilateral or unilateral. The joint angles and doing things one side at a time, it's really not a big rock, especially when you're looking at all the components of specificity, not just the joint angles. That's one part of it. I mean, hell, if anything, my bias would be to avoid making the strength training look too much like their sport, because again, we're just getting a lot of redundancy there and we're increasing our likelihood of overuse injuries. At the end of the day, humans thrive in a variable environment. I'm going to use strength training to get them to move slightly different to their sport deliberately. And now, sort of coming at things from this Westside perspective that powerlifters, they know the weight room better than anyone else. They're the experts at strength training. I tend to agree with them. On that side of things. Having said that, I think what was useful about that Boyle perspective is sort of to show that there's more than one way to skin a cat. A lot of the reason why powerlifters even choose bilateral exercises, it's not even that they're the most effective way to strength train, it's just that's what their competition movements are. So strength training is the umbrella term, and then powerlifting is actually a subcomponent of strength training. So powerlifters, they're experts in strength training, they're really, really good at it, but they're not the be-all, end-all authority on how you should strength train for your goals. So we can learn a lot from powerlifters, and we should definitely be interested in what they have to say, but then we need to remember our own goals and what strength training means to us and what we're trying to get out of it specifically. But where they definitely copped some unnecessary criticism was around this idea that chasing a higher number on the bar and doing bilateral lifts is inherently unsafe when it comes to training outcomes. There's significantly less injury risk from a heavy bilateral squat than going and playing a rugby match or something like that. So where do I sit on that continuum? Well, I'll be honest, currently I have no unilateral strength training in my current programming. That doesn't mean I'm against it, but I definitely don't think it's something that's essential, and especially for athletes who have to locomote. Like, I think if you're already doing a lot of locomotion, there's even less need to make your strength training locomotive. This is also like a personal bias, so one person who has done so well to change the reputation of how we approach unilateral strength training is Alec Blennis. He comes at it from the perspective of, I think he likes it because it's a little bit riskier. Heavier weights, more unstable setups. Don't get me wrong, he still achieves good proximity to failure, so he's not letting the instability of the setup change or reorient the goal of his strength training. But yeah, if you want a good role model for how to implement unilateral strength training, a unilateral emphasis on your strength training without training like a cuck, Alec Blennis is your man. Because again, he brings the same attitude to unilateral strength training that I romanticize about all the strength sports. He's just an absolute animal. He's not doing it to try to absolve him. He's not doing it to try to eke out some sort of dynamic correspondence or to mitigate some made-up injury risk. He loves heavy split squats, and I think that that's mad. Whereas again, a lot of people, the reason why they're attracted to split squats is because you don't have to go as heavy. I'm not going to lie, my phone's on the other side of the gym and I can't be asked checking the program, so I'm just going to assume it's sets of 3, but it might be a set of 5. It's not that serious, we're just trying to get a leg strength stimulus, you know? The mode of pattern and then proximity to failure. Well, that's the way I look at it. One of the genuine differences between unilateral strength training and bilateral strength training that I think is worth considering at least is the emphasis on frontal plane versus sagittal plane stability. So when you have both your feet in a line, you're very stable in a side-to-side sense, and your biggest issue from a stability perspective is not falling forwards or backwards. As soon as you adopt more of an asymmetrical, like a split squat or a staggered stance, then all of a sudden I find that I'm much more stable in terms of the forwards and the backwards, but it's the side-to-side. So when we are in this staggered stance, we are emphasizing a little bit more frontal plane stability, challenging the glutes and the adductors a little bit more. It's not that the glutes and the adductors just go to sleep as soon as you have a feet in line, absolutely not the case, but just in terms of the stability that you're challenging. And so then, like, what's the trickle-down effect of doing a little bit more work with that frontal plane emphasis? I don't know. I think it can be good for your hip internal rotation. I think a lot of people, where they're just doing a lot of where they're doing just a lot of bilateral strength training, a lot of them, they just don't have the best hip internal rotation. It's like a classic gripe for people who do a lot of powerlifting style training. Whereas that is one thing that I do love about the split squat. We go from this big focus on always like shortening all these muscles on the outside of our hips and legs, to then all of a sudden getting a lot of length through them. And so, wouldn't you know, it's a pretty fucking reasonable and effective take to have a little bit of both in your programming. Some bilateral stuff, some unilateral stuff. Like everything in the fitness industry, vegans versus carnivores, Westside versus Boyle. The most reasonable people are always just doing a little bit of both. So if you can take away anything from this unilateral versus bilateral strength training debate, it's that anyone who has a really hard stance on either of them is probably an idiot, and they're not really worth listening to. Listen to the people who like a little bit of both, because it tends to be the best option, no matter what you're debating. The middle ground. And if you want to make some content of your own, we're going to get a few more online leads going your way, then download my content creation and e-com ebook. It'll help you get consistent with that side of things.